and thank you everyone for being here. I'm greeting you from Barcelona right now because even though I'm based in Turin, I'm often in Barcelona. As Dimitra said, I'm one of the volunteers of the Dinamo Foundation. I'm on their strategic board, and I'm also the person who is kind of supporting the research on the projects that this organization is doing. So I prepared some slides, which I hope will help. And I'm just going to share them. Let's see what would be the best way. Maybe I can open it and share my screen. Let's see. So what I've tried to do is to bring together some of the research that I've done, let's say, kind of as a researcher, and I'm a, can you see it? Fantastic. So as an human geographer, urban geographer working on housing and housing justice and housing alternatives, but also some of the research that we have done collaboratively within La Dinamo to document and also to inspire ourselves and hopefully also others on what can be the dynamics, what kind of processes, what kind of policies, what kind of intersections between forms of co-housing, forms of cooperative housing, and more broadly, the aims of decommodifying housing. I think, so the study that Dimitra was mentioning, that some of you might be aware of, and some probably aren't, was a study that we did about, I think it was about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. It was a sort of a collaboration between 3 researchers, Carles Bages from La Colle, the architectural organization that is behind many of the more innovative form of architecture around cooperative housing in Catalonia, northern Spain, myself, in between institutions as always, and Lorenzo Vidal, also in between institutions as always. And so this study, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study. It's open access, so you can download it, you can look at it. There are many things I would do differently now, but just to give you a bit of a sense, we had a number of questions, which I think are probably the questions that you also are asking yourselves. So there were questions that emerged from needs and desires of trying to establish new models of and for housing cooperative in Catalonia, in Spain, but and the desire to learn from other experiences. And within that, we were interested in policies and in public support to explore both the potential, but also the limits of state-mediated redistribution of resources, land, properties, and subsidies. So the public is not there necessarily seen as something that we think should provide responses always, but definitely we thought it was important to understand how in other countries the public had been leveraged to sort of gain access to resources such as land, such as buildings, such as financing, for example. And so when we're talking about public cooperative, we took a very broad understanding of cooperative alternatives. We had 2 conditions. One of the conditions was that the residents, at least nominally, had to have control over the collective management and or the ownership of the housing. That doesn't necessarily mean, in some places it might just be the management, in some places it's everything. But we thought it was important that there was that element of control. So we excluded all forms of social housing that did not include the residents themselves. And also our second condition was that the individual units could not be bought and sold on the open market. So we were interested in models that combined this management dimension with at least an aspiration to some form of decommodification, or at least of mitigation of the commodification dynamics in terms of real estate. The study was designed to collect as many case studies as possible of examples that we knew were interesting. It's not at all exhaustive, but we were interested in policies and examples and instances that both historical and contemporary that had some elements of best practice, if you wish. And so in this case, it's a very uneven set of policies. Many are municipal, but some are supra-municipal. And in some places, we're talking about regions, and in other cases, we're talking about cities or states. And we created a framework that I'm going to tell you about now. And this framework is the result of looking across different case studies, these 10 sites, let's say, the Netherlands, the city of New York in the US, England within the UK, Quebec in Canada, Austria, Uruguay, Denmark, Germany, one region specifically in Italy and Switzerland. And the idea, so we commissioned these studies, some of them we wrote ourselves because we had done research in these countries, and some we commissioned externally. And the idea for us was really to kind of understand also a bit of the processes. So you will find each case study has a bit of a historical contextualization and a little bit of a sense of how, in a sense, there are multiple rights and multiple claims being made in many of these situations of state-mediated redistribution, that the links between the state and cooperatives often developed through conflict, sometimes through collaboration. So it's often many of these policies emerge from mass mobilizations or emerge from specific lobbying. And it's very important in that sense to be aware of this place specificity. So of course, you cannot understand how in Germany something is possible if you don't understand the complex banking system that supports certain forms of financing, for example, etc. So of course, there is always, as in any comparative study, the risk of place decontextualization, but just be aware of that. And what we were interested in when we designed this framework was to think about the chain of housing provision in a sense, and we identified 3 different phases or moments in the cooperative housing life cycle, which we thought were very important to bring together in one framework, not just in terms of the analysis, but also in terms of understanding the full story. As architects or as people involved in different kind of housing movement, we might be tempted to focus very much on the production element. So we want more cooperative housing. We want to think about how to gain land, how to gain property. But it's very important while we do that to also bear in mind questions of access, questions of management. So what kind of policies can support that? And if those policies are not in place, what should be the demands? And thirdly, the maintenance of the model in time. So we found, having this historical approach, that sometimes a very good policy or a very good set of policies in a specific moment in time did not hold. And so processes of privatization or processes of exclusionary access then emerge over time. And this was important for us to maintain in our framework. So I don't know how easy it is for you to read this, but this is in a sense the kind of more detailed outline. So you have on the left-hand side here, the production, access and management, maintenance of the model over time. And here you have, in a sense, the sub areas of policies that we identified for each of these. And then these more specific policies. So just as a reminder, we started from this column, the kind of more detailed policies, and then we tried to create kind of wider themes. So in terms of production, and I thought this was perhaps the area that was more interesting for you, so I will talk more about this. But just to say now very briefly that there is a range of historical and contemporary models, but that in any case, the element of production, financing, direct and indirect subsidies, technical support, and access to land and buildings always needs to be also thought about in relation to the other two elements. Access and affordability. So what happens when we try to establish a cooperative housing sector or a co-housing sector with some co-management dimension? What happens to questions around regulation, for example, regulations on access? Who gets access? What kind of policies, for example, can be used to support greater inclusivity? What kind of policies can support the subsidies that maintain affordability in time? So not just at the moment of entering, but also over time. And so, for example, here we can think about direct subsidies to individuals, or we can think about subsidies to the projects themselves in, for example, in relation to environmental kind of fuel and energy consumption and energy justice. Or we can think about elements, forms of regulations and form of policies that support the integration of some more vulnerable populations, for example. And here, some of the critical issues, I think, are the ways in which in our cities there are many who are not living in sort of formally, perfectly official kind of housing, and therefore are automatically excluded from accessing credit or from title to property or from subsidies. And so this is an important dimension to bear in mind. The question of maintenance of the model, we think about it in a more political sense as what kind of infrastructure do we need to maintain these models over time, particularly the question of decommodification, but also the question of governance. And here we have a series of different regulations that have developed over time by more mature sectors in some countries or by quite innovative new sectors in others. And some of the issues there are, for example, what kind of policies would we propose if we could write these policies or propose them to balance what are, for example, grassroots processes of management and building and forms of other governance that might be interested in supporting a project but might find it hard to do so. And also what alliances are possible across which sectors. So now I'm going to talk a bit about policies to support production and the promotion of new cooperatives. I think one of the key issues that has emerged over time and that I think is probably of interest to you, since you want to deal with vacancies and you want to think about the repurposing what already exists, is this tension between policies that support house building, which in a sense go along this discourse of housing supply as the solution to the housing crisis, and policies that are supporting repurposing existing building or in any case kind of addressing what is already existing and modifying it. And so in this sense, the aim might be to look for policies or to apply existing policies to transform property relations without transforming the building themselves, or sometimes the buildings themselves need to be transformed, but that can be done, for example, with more sustainable sort of policies in place. And there might be a lot of positives to this. So you might, for example, work within an existing neighborhood. You might reduce the risk of, you might reduce the embedded carbon, for example, in demolition or rebuild, or the carbon that is produced by new build. And so in a sense, I think, but this tension is something that is not necessarily there yet in terms of policies. And I just wanted to mention the Catalan case as an example. So many of you will be familiar with it. It's a sector that has grown quite exponentially in the last 10 years. The first three grant of use cooperative housing were presented already a bit this tension. There was a rural one, there was a specific legal form in an already existing building, series of buildings, in fact, called casas. And then in the city of Barcelona, the two projects that pioneered this model, La Borda and Princesa, were very different. La Borda, built on public land by La Colle. Princesa was a rehabilitation of an existing publicly owned building. And if you fast forward to 2023, to last year, we go from 44 dwellings to nearly 1,000 dwellings across Catalonia. I would say 2/3 of them are sort of under construction or under rehabilitation. There is quite a variety of it. And as you can see, they're spread. Some of them are rural, some of them are urban, some of them are peri-urban. The ones in the city of Barcelona, so Barcelona is the smaller, so the larger kind of, this map is Catalonia, and this is Barcelona. The growth of the Barcelona models was, in a sense, kind of emerged thanks to the inscription of cooperative housing and cessió-d'ús, or grant of use, within local housing policies by the municipality. There were 2 public calls, 7 plots of land in 2016, and 3 plots of land in 2019. All of these new build. Now, in 2019, 2020, there begins to be a bit of a shift. And so the call, so the call for tender for public land also included publicly owned buildings. And so there has been a shift towards also understanding existing buildings in public ownership as a possible resource that can be mobilized here. But it's a shift that is still encountering, I think, some of the, it's still kind of encountering some difficulties, but I just wanted to put it out there as to show that the policies have not been homogeneous over time. So in our mechanism, or in our framework, aside from the sale of public land as an access to land and buildings, I think some of the clusters of policies that you might be interested in have to do with the lease of public land and property. So an example of this is in Quebec, which has a very large and important cooperative sector. You have a situation where both the Quebecois Housing Society, which is a regional public organism, and the local authorities can lease public buildings to cooperatives for a minimum period of 50 years and with fixed ground rent. So of course, this already creates the infrastructure for some of these projects that don't have upfront capital, for example, to buy land or to buy property. In England, the cooperative movement that emerged particularly in the early 1970s and then developed during the 1980s very much had to do with the leasing of publicly owned properties, both by municipalities and by public institutions, in what is called as short-term cooperatives. So that is the leasing model. Another line is, which kind of overlaps a little bit with the leasing, is the types of policies that are supporting cooperatives because cooperatives are providing refurbishment or rehabilitation or redesign of existing housing. So in a sense, if the first one of the leasing maybe sits more within housing policies, this one sits more within urban policies or policies against dilapidation, against vacancy. And here we collected some interesting examples, for example, in New York City, which has a number of different public programs, and some of them have been used more recently to establish community land trusts in the city on the basis of existing buildings that required some degree of renovation. So, for example, in the East Harlem Community Land Trust, you can see there are buildings that the private owners have let in many ways dilapidate, and therefore the municipality can intervene and then can assign that for a minimal ground rent to a community organization, which can then develop an alternative form of tenure. Other examples, other policies that we looked at, for example, in Italy, there are a number of regional laws for auto recupero cooperativo, so self-rehabilitation in a cooperative vein. We looked at Lazio in this the region, which is the region of Rome in this study, but in other studies, I found there are similar examples also in Tuscany, and other regions are trying to develop them themselves. And in this case, they were understood as a model for buildings that are occupied, either through a protest occupation or through sort of squatting for living. And this was some way, in a sense, to ensure legalization of these occupations, but also to divert some of public financing for the rehabilitation of these buildings, which then remain in public ownership, part of it, and part are privately owned with different levels of responsibility. In England, local governments, as I was mentioning, started transferring on leases decrepit buildings through policies which were designed for kind of neighborhood, sort of to improve neighborhoods rather than necessarily to address housing. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things in this case study, since it's something that I've studied in quite some depth. Many of the cooperatives in London, you would not be able to tell apart from other buildings because they were, in many cases, buildings which were dilapidated, that became occupied, or that otherwise were negotiated through these short life leases. I put short life in inverted commas because in some cases they went on for 30 years. In some cases they dissolved, so they became social housing, publicly managed. In some cases they remain tenants managed organizations. And according to my estimates, at least 33 of existing mutual housing co-ops in London originated from this early short life 1970s model, and at least 25 originated from squatting before the short life. And again, I think the policies were not just local, there was also a national framework that enabled low-income households to form themselves into cooperatives, which was not the case at the time. There was government support, so there were sort of grants for the rehabilitation and refurbishment of these properties in 1975. And this is what enabled these kind of hybrid forms where you have publicly owned buildings, but then tenants management co-ops that might be responsible for the upkeep or the refurbishment. Other models that we looked at, we discussed in this document, in this study, were ownership transfers, sometimes directly to cooperatives, sometimes to housing associations with some degree of cooperative management. And so we found some examples of this in the UK. We found some examples of this in Holland. Some of them are policies which are very hard to take up. Some of them were possible at a specific moment in time. Something else that we looked at, but again, these examples are, I think, more specific to Northern European context, where maybe there is a lot of public sector or third sector involvement in new developments. So you might, for example, have a reserve, so a number of units or a building in a new urban development plan that are reserved for cooperative management. And so in this case, we're not talking about existing vacant properties, but we're talking about properties within a new built scheme, which are just for that. And we found some examples of these policies in Tyrol, in Austria, in Holland, in Denmark. Historically, the Danish case really benefited from this, and also in Germany, but in specific municipalities such as Freiburg and Hamburg. One tool that we thought was quite interesting here, and we're beginning to enter not publicly owned buildings, but privately owned buildings, often, is the use of preemption rights and the rights of first refusal. This can involve buildings, they can involve land, they can be lived in, or they can be vacant. I know this is very confusing, but I hope it's helpful. So in Denmark, for example, much of one dimension of the cooperative housing sector was very much based on a law that was passed in the 1970s that allowed tenants living in apartment blocks a preemption right over their homes if they formed a cooperative. So tenants had the possibility to buy their property, the properties they lived in, through a cooperative form. And of course, there are different regulations. In Austria, it's the local government that can use preemption right over land to offer it to limited profit housing developers. In Germany, preemption rights have been used by tenants to purchase properties and establish, for example, some of the projects of the Miethäuser Syndicate. And in Catalonia, so I can tell you a little bit more about this case, the use of preemption and intervention rights is something that was introduced in 2015 with a decree law on sort of the housing crisis. And this basically allows, in very specific cases, a third sector entity or a public sector entity to intervene into a transaction between two market actors if there are financial institutions involved, and if, for example, a real estate investment fund, and if the property is vacant due to a foreclosure process. This comes under a series of measures, and I'm freely translating, the extraordinary and urgent measures for the mobilization of housing from foreclosure processes. So this was very much a response at the Catalan level, so by the Parliament of Catalonia, to the foreclosure crisis of following the global financial crisis. And so one of these examples is an example that La Dinamo has promoted in Lleida. You can see it up here is the province of Lleida. This was a building that fitted precisely this kind of situation. It was purchased by La Dinamo using this right of preemption of first refusal, and thanks to also the lobbying for specific credit, the Catalan Institute of Finance provided a specific loan that enables an organization such as Dinamo to buy such a large project and to turn it into a cooperative. So in this case, it's a 30-unit building. 24 houses are qualified as social housing. So the members of the cooperative that live within them have an income below the social housing threshold or within the social housing threshold. And then 6 of these housing, and this is also something part of the specific Catalan law on this right of preemption and refusal, are allocated to what they call emergency housing. So these are normally for more vulnerable households that require social service support. And just to give you some figures, there is a 4,000 euros down payment and a monthly contribution of 400, which mostly goes to repay this loan by the Catalan Institute of Finance. The last set of policies, or more than policies, is more a sort of thinking around what could be done with existing buildings, I suppose. This picture shows the projects that La Dinamo is supporting at the moment. Some of them are projects that are being developed, so they're new built. A few of them are groups that are already living together in buildings that already exist. But many of them, the ones that you see in black, they are all either on private land or within private buildings which are being repurposed. And so I think in this sense, it's quite important to think about the mechanisms that a third sector organization such as La Dinamo can put into practice to recuperate properties, to kind of reclaim properties from the private sector and transform them into cooperatives. Some of these could be through donation, there could be a direct purchase, either of land or of the building. There can be, as was the case with La Kloska, preemption and intervention rights, so the use of specific types of mechanisms. and legal possibilities. And then something, and so for example, an example of this is La Titaragna, which is a project that involves 3 different organizations buying the land, and then the building becoming is owned then by the cooperative itself. So in this case, we have a separation of land and the building. So it could be considered a community land trust, even though legally it's not yet constituted as such. And here again, there are grants that have supported, for instance, the rehabilitation of the building. So kind of central government grants for refurbishment. And also other forms of credit that we can go into detail more if you're interested in. But just to say, this is quite a complex case study. And in fact, we're going to give a presentation in June because we are writing this up as a case study as we speak. And then the last but not least is a very pilot example that I know Dimitra has already heard me talk about, which is thinking about mechanism through which flats that are owned by people who are already living in them, but who do not want to leave them as inheritance to anyone else, or who would like to donate them, but they're still living in them and it's their home. So, you know, instead of leaving them in their will, they might decide to do a form of some form of rethinking around the ownership. So to do a sort of a donation while in life, but where they also gain an annuity, maintaining a right of usufruct for life. So maintaining the possibility to live in them in perpetuity. And this is something that has been piloted by La Dinamo in one case, so it's still one example. But the idea is, on the one hand, to support elderly people who might find themselves in the intersecting crisis of failing welfare and care systems, but at the same time, who are still capable of living and willing to live in their own home, but also interested in sort of ensuring that their property doesn't end up to a, well, in this case in particular, doesn't end up back on the market. And so in this sense, this is a mechanism that we think has potential, because we know that there are a lot of people who might be owning properties. They might need some form of income, and there might be some way in which financially that need can be met for a certain period of time, while at the same time these properties start to become part of what we would call here, or we propose to call, a dispersed cooperative, or a cooperative that might have different units across a neighborhood. And again, I'm just proposing this example. There aren't any policies so far that support this, but given that we are in Southern Europe, and given that we are facing with an aging crisis, a welfare crisis, and a care crisis, we think this is something worth exploring. So maybe just to conclude and to give some inputs, some of the questions to ask when we're thinking about cooperativizing vacant housing or cooperativizing existing built environment is the question of ownership. What legal and policy frameworks would support a change in ownership if this is what is being proposed? Maybe it's not the ownership that needs to be changed, maybe it's the management. Maybe there can be temporary forms of ownership, for example, through a lease. But then if that's a temporary solution, you know, I think some of the questions to be asked is until when? And the case in point of the in England of the short life cooperatives, I think is quite telling. At the end of some of these leases, many of them returned to public ownership or were sold off. So I think it's important, whatever the format, that these legal and policy frameworks make sense also in relation to a longer term aim. There is a physical dimension, which of course is in what conditions are you working or are you proposing to repurpose vacant housing? Which policy frameworks and direct or indirect subsidies could be mobilized? So perhaps there are policies that can be mobilized or can be lobbied for to support taking over dilapidated housing. There can be policies that support refurbishment or energy efficiency retrofitting. And of course, different countries have different examples. Now, there are some critical points, I think, that is worth raising. Some of the existing buildings might be environmentally unsustainable. They might be badly built. They might be very expensive to refurbish, maybe even more expensive to refurbish than to demolish. They might be very expensive to heat or to cool or to maintain. This is something that, for example, the cooperatives that I mentioned in London are facing, because in many cases, those were relatively low quality housing, Victorian housing. So it was already relatively old and dilapidated in the 1970s. And of course, the upkeep now is quite important. And so even though they have affordability and they have management, self-management, they are now encountering a crisis of fuel and a crisis of energy. Another option has to do with normative understandings that underpin the built environment. So much of what is already built tends to be built around understandings of nuclear families. So the rooms themselves are built in a specific way, the building themselves are built in a specific way with a specific type of life in mind. And so often the projects and other cooperatives that I've also studied in the UK and other contexts, they have to do extensive work to remodel them internally and perhaps add elements, which of course can be expensive. So something to bear in mind as well. Then there is the question of whether the framework, the legal framework and ownership is around full transfer of temporary leases. And finally, and I put this here because I'm a geographer, and of course this is for me quite important, when we work with vacant housing, we need to ask ourselves where those vacant houses are, whether they are in areas that have been disinvested, why have they been disinvested, are these areas that are already suffering from territorial stigmatization, segregation of vulnerable populations, what kind of services are there, are we producing cooperative housing only in the peripheries of cities, are we only going to do them in areas that are where already the land values are quite low? And if we do so, then there are a series of politics that have to do with the place and the location of those projects in the context of the wider city, which I think are quite important to bear in mind. Here are some references, and thank you so much, and apologies for being late.